So I'm just going to go over some of the basics. If you guys have questions about anything uh, or want to, try stuff, let me know. We can do that. I'm just going to make like a little test scene and go over some of the basics of um, lighting and materials and textures. So we haven't, as I said, we've kind of talked about these things with some of our example scenes, but we haven't actually like gone over them specifically. Um, so I'm going to make just a test scene. So I'll make a new 3D scene. Uh, call this lighting, materials, textures. So these are like three of the main components that determine what stuff looks like essentially in a 3D scene. A lot of what the 3D rendering software is doing is basically determining, part of it is determining what shapes look like from different perspectives. So when you have the camera position, things look different. Obviously, from different perspectives, it's not 2D, but we are representing it on a 2D surface, which is our computer screen. Um, and in the VR helmet, it's two 2D surfaces that are meshed together using the stereoscopic vision, but it's still 2D. So a lot of what the game engine is doing is calculating the geometry and what it should look like from different angles and perspectives. But another big part of what it's doing is determining what color all the pixels on the screen should be, and that's a very complicated determination with 3D because we have objects, we have the color of the objects, we have the lighting in the scene, and 3D rendering engines, especially today, use what's called physically based rendering. So that's why when we look at Godot, if we look at the documentation, um, this is their spatial shader, which is it's called a PBR material. Although I don't see that term here. Let's just go PBR. So we kind of talked about this a little bit at the very beginning of the semester when we were talking about 3D graphics, but PBR is like the main standard for the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years for 3D rendering. It stands for physically based rendering, and it's basically instead of like sort of like imitating specific aspects of how things look, it's actually calculating how light bounces around a scene, how different types of materials sort of interact with light. Okay. And so we'll look at some of the properties here. So, oops, didn't mean to open that. So we have objects in the scene, but then we also have lights. And so lights determine how bright things are, or they can change the color. And then we also have textures, which are just two images that are wrapped around an object. So we're going to look at all three of those and look at some of the properties. If you look at the documentation for the Godot spatial material, you'll see that there are lots and lots of properties. There's lots and lots of different ways that we can change how these materials interact with the lighting in the scene. So we don't have time to go over everything, but I'll go over what are kind of like the main properties. And then you guys, of course, can explore the other properties on your own. There's a lot of good examples of like different more complex topics in here that we probably won't get to. So I would definitely recommend looking at this. I'll put a link to this in the video as well. But there's a lot of different things because it's trying to recreate what things look like in the real world as closely as it can. So I'm just going to create like a little scene of meshes. I'm not going to make any like colliders or anything like that. I'm just going to work on showing a few basic things with lighting and materials. So I'm going to start off, I'm just going to add a mesh, and I'll make this like a floor. So we can use this to kind of see shadows and things like that. So for my floor mesh, I'm going to choose a plane. And I'll click on here. I'll make this bigger. I'll make this like 32 by 32. And let's add in another mesh to represent the player. And I'm just going to add in a capsule here just to give some sense of space. So I'll make a new capsule mesh. Going to rotate it over 90 degrees and lift it up a little bit. And there we go. So we can use this this is like our basic player height. Let's actually make the floor a little bit bigger, 64 by 64. So one thing that we noticed right away, I'm going to go to the view and turn off some of our gizmos. Let's turn off our I don't see the. I guess I can't turn off the. Okay, whatever. I'll just leave that. Anyway, if we look at these, we can see that there's the colors change, right? When we look around, if I look over here, the bottom of the player is dark, the top of the player is lighter, whereas the surface, the floor, is just one big color because it's flat. So light is reflecting off of this the same way. So one thing that you might be wondering is we haven't actually added any light to the scene yet, right? So why can we see stuff? So one of the things that's built into Godot is called the world environment. That's why we can see this like sky gradient, and we can see this little sun, and we have this like ground color. And when Godot is calculating the colors in the scene, it's actually using the values from the surrounding sky when it's creating that color. So we can actually change that, but there's a default environment. If we want to change the environment, we have to add an environment node. So we can click on the plus here, look up environment. There's a basic world environment, and we can move this up to the top. And by default, okay, there's nothing in there. So that's why we have this like little error. So we have to add in a new environment. So notice when I add in the environment, suddenly there's no lighting. Okay, so we haven't made any settings in the environment. Okay, so we just have a background that's a clear color. And what that means is essentially that's that gray color. So it's just drawing a gray background. And we can turn that on or off, but it doesn't really matter because it's just gray. And so there's nothing in the environment that's kind of there by default. We can set these things. So we'll come back to this in a second, but what we can do is add our own lighting. So you might not have a scene that's set in like an outdoor world. You might be creating completely artificial lighting. So if we want to add a light, we can just click the plus button, type in light, and we'll see there's a few different types of light. There's a directional light, which is going to be kind of like our sunlight. It doesn't have a position, it only has a direction. There's an omni light, which is more like a light bulb. It shows light everywhere, but it has a position. And then there's a spotlight, which has both a position and a direction. So let's add a directional light. This will give our scene kind of the main lighting. And so notice with the directional light, so now you can see the arrow that's pointing, and that's the direction that the light is going in. So now our player is very light here because the light is coming from this direction. So you can see if I move my directional light, nothing changes. The position of the directional light doesn't matter. The only thing that matters with the directional light is the angle, the direction. So if I move this guy, usually, you can put it wherever since it doesn't matter. So usually I'll put it up here somewhere, so it's not like taking up space in my scene. And then I'm going to point it down a little bit. And so now we're applying light to the surface of these objects. So we can see the effect that a single light has. So we can see we have this bright spot here, which is the exact direction of the light. And then behind where the light is not reaching at all, it's dark. So we can see the floor isn't really reflecting any light, but we can change that. We can add stuff here. So that's our directional light. Obviously, you can add more than one directional light. So, I could duplicate this. usually we use like a combination of different lights. So you can get more interesting effects. You can also change the color. So if I take this directional light, I can go to the light and I can change the color. If I want it to be the sun, I might make it like a little yellowish, so it's a little bit warmer. If it was like night and I want it to be the moon, maybe I'd make it a little blue, but it's still very light. It's still a very light color. If I make it dark, obviously it's going to be darker. But if I want this to be the sun, I could do something like that. And then I could rename this sun. But we can also make the sun in our environment. So we'll do that in a second. So I'm going to leave this directional light here. Another thing that the directional light will give you is shadows. So they're not on by default. That's why we don't see a shadow here. We turn this on. Now we see a shadow. So one of the weird things with Godot is that the shadow for a light is not on by default, but the shadow for objects is on by default. So when I click this, there's immediately a shadow. And we'll see it when we look at the material that you can turn the shadows off for objects, whether they cast or receive shadows. Another thing that's kind of fun that you can do with the light is you can make it negative. So it's going to be the opposite of whatever the light is, but we don't have enough other stuff in the scene for that right now, so we can come back to that. And then you can change the brightness. That's the energy here. So we can make it really bright, or you can make it dim, and you can control that. You can animate that or control it programmatically. There's also indirect energy, which is like the bounces. There's some stuff we can do with the shadow. We'll skip this stuff. So those kind of our basic stuff with the directional light. Let's add another light before we go back to our world texture. Let's add an omni light. So this light, I'm going to change the color so we see the influence that it has. But you can see the position matters. So as I move the light, we see this sort of glow from the light moving. And we also see this circle around or sphere around the light shows us kind of like the influence of the light. So let's move this up here. And let's say I was like, just trying to add some environmental lighting. I could change the color here. I'm going to choose like a weird color just to be kind of make it obvious what's going on. So I'm going to make it like pink. So we can see very clearly where this light is coming from. And you can see where these lights also mix together. So if I have the lights hitting the same part of the object, you can see the mix of lights together as well. So with this light, there's energy, which again is how bright it is. And then there's also, where is it? Oh, it's under the Omni properties, the range of the light, how far the light goes. So we can obviously just increase how much light there is. There's also this thing called attenuation, which is basically like how the light falls off. Lights are brighter when they're closer to the light, and they get less bright as we go farther away. And if I drag this down, I'll have a very bright sort of center and less bright outside. And if I drag it up, then it'll be really bright everywhere. So I can kind of like change the fall off or how quickly the light goes from bright to not influencing very much. You can see it's like really bright when it's close and then it falls off, or we curve the other way, it just stays really bright. It's almost like basically a circle. Although I turned the energy all the way up for that, so let's turn that down. And then I can add a lot of these if I want to. I can just like duplicate this and put another one over here. And we can start to like get some different kind of interesting effects by combining lights. I haven't even changed the color of the object yet. I'm just using lighting. So you can get some kind of cool effects. The more lighting you add, the more work Godot is doing to calculate all of this different stuff. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But a few lights is not going to kill the performance. Let's actually add in a couple more meshes just so we can see how this interacts with other objects. So I'm going to add in, excuse me, I'm going to add in a cube, move it over here. So the cube is kind of flat, so the light interacts with it differently. I'll turn this into like a little tree trunk. And let's add in a sphere, which is also going to interact differently. So I'll add a, where is it, sphere, and move this guy up here. And let's make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so you can kind of see how the light interacts with these different flat or round surfaces. The sphere, I can also change the number of segments. So if I lower the number of segments here, you'll start to see the edges, and that kind of changes how the light works a little bit. There's a lot of different ways that we can influence how these things look. Okay, so let's go back to our environment for a second. I'm going to turn off all these lights. So a lot of the time we do want to have some type of environment, especially if your scene is outdoors. So Godot has a lot of built-in stuff for us. We can also get stuff from other sources, but a lot of the built-in stuff is good. So we can use a color. If we just set a color, we can say that the background is red or blue or whatever. If you're doing something like stylized, this might work. But you can also do things like the sky or color plus sky. Let's just do sky for now, and we can choose a panorama sky is when you have like images that fill out the sky. We're going to just use a procedural sky for now, so it's just going to design the sky for us. So you can see that looks a lot like our default sky. There's the sun. And you can kind of change the orientation and stuff. You can change the energy, so we can make it like, a different time of day or something like that. There's also ambient light. This is just light that gets applied everywhere. So let's say our energy was 0 and we had no light. We could still, if we wanted just to see our geometries, we could apply just like a tiny bit of ambient light. Maybe I need a, our ambient light is not working. Okay, we'll try this later, but let's bring back our sky for a second. I guess we need our sky for the ambient light. Like if I change this color. Oh, maybe I need to, oh, here we go, sky contribution. Okay. So if I turn off the sky contribution to the ambient light, now I can just have the ambient light. So this is not going to shadow or create texture. It's just going to fill in whatever this color is. It's just going to fill it in exactly that color. So you might not want ambient light, or you might want just like a little bit just to make sure things are visible. Or if you want to stylize something, you could make everything a little bit blue or a little bit, yellow. But this is more of a stylized look. So let's turn the sky contribution back on. You can also add fog here. So fog is like a way that a lot of games will fill in space so that you don't have to create like a massive world. You can just fill in some fog. I don't think this scene is big enough that we're going to see fog. So we're going to have to set the fog level much lower. Okay, so this is unrealistic, but if you had a bigger scene, you can see that the fog essentially is just adding a blank color here. So if I change the color of the fog, it's just like slowly fading the fog in from our position in the camera. So that's a good way to kind of hide the background if you don't want to build out a whole scene. But let's turn that off for now. There's a bunch of other stuff that you can do in here. In adjustments, there's a whole lot of stuff you can do. Brightness. These are just post-processing effects. So this is not actually, this is adding on to after the scene is created, you're just adding on. So you can change the contrast of the scene and the saturation as well. So that's, you can do some stylization there. For color correction, you can add in like a gradient here and you could get some pretty wild effects with a gradient. So like I could make everything in a much narrower range of color, or I could squash everything down, or I can add colors in here. I can make a really stylized scene if I use some crazy gradients. So you can basically change every color to a different color. So gradients are really useful if you want to do stylized stuff. Most like basic color schemes for games are either going to be photorealistic or non-photorealistic. Non-photorealistic tends to be a little bit easier because you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to add really high-level textures and stuff like that. Photorealistic obviously has a more realistic look. Most games these days are a little bit of both, but these are some things you can do if you're not going for a photorealistic look. Okay, let's get rid of that though because it's kind of distracting. There any? I thought there was something else here, but I think that might be it. So let's turn our adjustments off. Let's turn our lighting back on. So now we can see with all this lighting, it's starting to get very bright. Maybe we'll turn the sun energy down a little bit. Okay. So there's obviously a lot more to cover with lighting, but let's stop there for now so we can talk about materials. And then eventually we'll also add texture. So let's start with our player. Or actually, let's leave our player the way it is as a default. Let's look at our tree trunk real quick. And we can add a material here. So in Godot, when I want to add a material, I can just close the mesh, click on material, click empty, and it's going to give me these two different material options. A shader material is when you actually write the code for the material yourself. This is something that I usually do if I'm working on something because you have a lot more control over what it looks like, especially if you're doing non-photorealistic stuff. It can be really useful, but it's challenging to write shader code. So we're going to do the built-in spatial material. And the spatial material has a lot of stuff that we can do with it. You can also create a spatial material and then save it as a shader material. So if you do want to read shader code for some reason, you can click convert to shader material and it'll actually show you the code that makes the material. That's like way more advanced than what we're talking about today, so we're not going to do that right now. But we can look at the basic ways to look at a material. And first, one thing I'm going to do, so we'll see these changes on the cube and the sphere. If you have a material that you like and you want to use it on other stuff, the way that you can do that is save it. So if you click this drop down and click save, I'm going to make a folder here called materials. And I'm going to call this tree. And so now I can apply my tree material to this part of the tree as well. I'll change it later, but for now I'm just going to have them look the same. So I can just drop this tree onto here. And now you'll see both of them are going to get updated when I edit this material. So if I click on the material again, it brings up the material in the inspector, and now I can edit both of these at the same time. So there's a bunch of stuff in here that we're not going to look at quite yet, but these flags can add different properties. We may come back to this in a minute. What we'll look at first is, or actually, where is parameters? So under parameters, this is where you can set your basic material properties. So there's a few different types of materials. The diffuse color is the color of like the main mesh. And there's a few different algorithms for determining how your diffuse color interacts with light. The default is the Burley. There's also Lambert. It's kind of hard to tell the differences between these, but you can, that one's a little more obvious, but you can take a look at them and see what you like. And then there's also tune shading. Tune shading is more stylized where it's not going to look, there isn't going to be a gradient between different colors. It's just going to be like flat, basically. So tune shading is useful, again, if you're doing non-photorealistic stuff. You might want to, well, I'll come back to it. Making it look good is kind of challenging. So let's come back to that in a second. The albedo is the main color of your mesh. So if I just want to set a color for material, I just want to make a green tree, I can just use the albedo, and there we go. We have our tree. The color can be just a color, but it can also be a texture. So that's how we can apply textures. And before we add a real texture, we can also create textures in Godot. So something that I do a lot, if I don't want to make or find a texture, is I just use some noise. So if I click new noise texture here and click noise, and then I can make some adjustments. This is just going to add a little bit of detail here. So it's very easy. I'm going to turn seamless on so we don't see any breaks. And then I can change the width here. If I want to make this more dense with detail, I can change the width to 1024, or I can play around with the noise settings. It'd be hard to go over how these really work, but you can play around with them and see what the difference is. So an easy one to adjust is the octaves. That adds a little bit more detail in here. The period kind of changes the sort of like amount of gradient between the different sections of the noise. There's also the persistence and the lacunarity. So mainly we can just play around with these and see what the effect is. And this is, again, good for non-photorealistic styling. If we just want to put a little texture on this and move on, we can do that. So there's other properties in here. So metallic is basically the way that it reflects light. So if we turn this all the way up and then turn the specular up, we're going to see different types of highlights. And let's turn the roughness down a bit. Okay, there we go. So the roughness is like how reflective a surface is. So if it's 0 roughness, it's going to be basically reflecting. And if it's 1 roughness, then it's not going to reflect light at all. So if we put this in the middle, and then we play with the metallic property, you can see if it's more metallic, it's going to be more reflective and like a harder surface. And then the specular is how bright that highlight is. So if we turn the specular all the way down, we don't see any highlight. If we turn it all the way up, we get this highlight. So that's not very realistic for a tree. Tree is going to be, more rough. But depending on what you're going for, you might play with different stuff there. You can also put textures in all of these properties. So for example, with our leaves in our tree, it might make sense to have some parts that are rough and some parts that aren't. So let's turn off this for a second, and let's add a roughness texture. So I'm going to click on here and go to noise and choose some noise. And let's play with these properties a little bit. A little bit hard to see, but there's some parts essentially where it's more reflective and some parts where it's less reflective according to this noise map. Normally you would use an image for this so you'd know where to look, but let's see, it's not that clear. Maybe if we increase this. Oh, and let's turn this up. There we go. Okay, now we can see that a little bit better. So now you can see there's this map where it's more reflective and less reflective. So now I don't have the noise on the color, I have the noise on the roughness. So you can get some different effects that way as well. Okay, reset these guys. So normal map is something I'll cover in a second when we add some textures. Rim and clear coat and anistrophy and ambient occlusion, transmission, refraction, all of these things are more sort of like complicated ways that light interacts with objects. So I'm not going to go over these, but you can look at the documentation, and this has very good examples of all these, more complex properties as you go through here. But we want to get to textures. The one other thing I want to look at, actually, we should look at textures if we're going to talk about UVs. So let's look at some textures. I'm going to leave this as is. Although, okay, one more thing I wanted to show. So let's say we like this material, but we want to change the color. So what I can do for my tree trunk, let's say we want to change this to a different color. I have the same material here, but I can click Make Unique, and now I'll have my own material based on this original one. So I can change the color of this one, and it's not going to affect the color of the original one. So I can change my tree trunk without changing the leaves. So if you have a material that you like, but you don't want to save a whole new material, you just want to change the color of one property, you can just click Make Unique, and it'll make a new material that's only applied to that object. All right, so let's talk about textures a little bit, and then we'll have covered most of the stuff that we need to cover. So we need to download a texture. A texture is an image file that gets wrapped around an object. So if you Google like Creative Commons 0, CC0 textures, there's a lot of different websites that have free textures that you can use. I might have showed this before, but let's take a look. So Open Game Art is a popular one. There's a bunch of other ones. Let's see. One looks kind of cool. But I want to make sure this has normals. Okay. So let's download this one. Okay. So I downloaded this zip. I'm going to extract it here and then open this up. And so notice that this comes with two different types of images. One is just the regular texture. This is just like the color data that we would want to see. And then one is this thing called a normal map. And it kind of looks the same, but it's got these like weird colors on it. And those colors are actually data that describe the height of the different parts of the texture. So let's just grab one of these. I'm going to go with this one over here and put that in our project. So I'm going to make a new folder. Let's see, where's my project? I'm going to make a new folder in here called textures. And then I'm just going to drag these textures in here. Okay, so then I'll go back to Godot. And so here's my textures down here. I have the ground and then the normal. There's actually some textures will come with a lot of other things like a roughness map, emission map, all these other properties that we've talked about. But I just want to show the normal because that is, one that is pretty frequently used. So I'm going to go to the floor here and go to material and add a new spatial material. And so for the regular texture, I just add that to the albedo. Albedo is basically color. So I'm going to put this ground texture here. And so this is a good time to talk about our UVs. So there's a couple of things wrong with this texture. One is that it's really big. It doesn't really look realistic if this is like our player size here. And then the other is it looks flat. Like it doesn't look realistic. It's supposed to be a somewhat realistic texture. So we can fix both of those things. So the first thing we need to do is change the UVs. UV is kind of a weird term, but it's essentially means the same thing as XY. But because when we're describing textures, we already have like the X, Y, Z, and W coordinates are already describing various parts of the mesh. UV is basically a stand-in for XY to stand for where the texture maps onto the mesh. And so if we want to change the way that this is scaled on here, we can change the scale here. So if we change the scale to like 2, okay, that's a little bit better. It's a little more realistic. Maybe we can change it to like 4. So now it's starting to look a little bit more normal or realistic to the scale of our scene. We might even go up to see what 8 looks like. Okay, that actually looks a little bit better. Okay, so the other thing is that it looks really flat, and that's what the normal is for. So when we look at how light is interacting with our floor, it's just coloring everything the same. So everything looks flat. The normal map will add basically height. So it'll add shadows to the mesh without having to like actually make, like it's still a flat surface, but it'll make shadows that match the detail. So if I go to normal map here and turn this on, and then I just grab my normal map and throw it in there. So it's pretty subtle, but notice now, let me find a part of the texture without the other crazy lights. So I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. Okay, I'll focus on the floor. There we go. Okay. So I'll zoom in here, and then I'm going to take my sun. And if I change the direction here, so if I rotate, actually, let's just grab it. Move this down. Okay, so if I move this, update, it doesn't really look like it. Maybe I'll turn the world off for a second. And it doesn't really look like it's updating. Okay, let's see if we can make it more dramatic. Okay. So I'm scaling this up to a ridiculous degree to try to see if we can see the shadows changing. There we go. Okay. See, now if I move the sun around, or maybe if I like rotate it like this, it'll be more dramatic. Oh yeah, that's better. So see how the shadows are changing according to the normal map? It looks like it's 3D. It looks like it has height, but that's just a trick that the rendering is doing by calculating the light as though the stones and the grass and stuff have different heights. So the normal map is a really easy way to add like a lot more sort of like depth and detail to a texture. So that it looks like it's actually interacting with the light in the scene without adding any like new geometry or meshes or anything like that. So it's pretty subtle. You can see I have to like really bump up the amount of the normals to make it obvious, but hopefully you can see the difference even when I don't scale it way up. Yeah, see when I scale it down, it looks kind of flat, but yeah, you can still kind of see there's some highlights. So yeah, maybe we'll scale it up just a little bit. Okay, so the same way that the normal map works, you can use it with other things. You can use it with a roughness map or an emission map. So I'm going to turn this off just as an example, and I'll throw this into the roughness. So now look over here. We zoom in a little bit. See how certain parts are shinier and other parts are rougher? You can see it over there as well. It's another way to get a little bit more realism is the amount of shininess. Actually, if we look at these bright lights over here, You can really see it. So if I go back, here's my texture. You can kind of see it's applying to different parts of the detail differently. Uh, if we put it on the emission channel, oh, I didn't talk about emission. Emission is actually if the thing itself outputs light. So let's turn the emission on. So if I turn emission on and I just put a color, you'll see that the floor is actually like shooting out color. It's not very realistic, but let's put a texture in there. So I'm just using the same normal texture for everything, which is not what I should be doing. But notice if I put that normal texture on there, it's like putting out light. It should be reflecting on the player, although it doesn't really look like it is. If I turn it up, it's going to get really bright. If I turn it down, it's going to be less bright. So again, this is the wrong map for this, but just showing that it works on other things. But this is really just the normal map. There's some places where if you download like a package of textures, it'll come with roughness and normals and metallic and whatever else. Okay, so let's turn the world back on. So if I want to do something, I'll do a couple more things and then we'll be done. So if I want to do something a little more stylized with my player, if I want to do a toon shader, I can go to my player material and if I go to parameters here, I can change both of the diffuse and the specular. So there's both diffuse and specular. Diffuse is the color of the main object and specular is the highlight. So you have to probably do both. So I'm going to change both of these to toon. And then if I want this to look good, I need to play with the roughness. So if I turn the roughness off, I'll get just this like really straight line between the two colors. If I add a little bit of roughness, I'll get a little bit more of a gradient here. So the sun is way too bright. Let's turn this down. Okay. Yeah, I've got way too many. These lights are also too close. Okay. So I can add just a little bit of roughness. And I get this like specular highlight here. This is like a little circle. So I can change that if I go to the specular. If I turn it all the way up, I'm just going to get that circle like that. If I turn it all the way down, then it bleeds out a little bit more. So you can see a little bit more about how these things work using the toon shader. And then you can get this kind of like stylized look on your rendering as well. All right, one more thing I want to show and then I'll be done. So the flags that we kind of glossed over earlier, if we look, I'm going to grab this one for a second. There's a bunch of different things that we can do that we don't normally need to do. But if we look at the flags, we can change. One thing you can do is just say unshaded. And so it's just going to be a color. It's going to ignore all the lighting. But we can also add transparency to this. And we could add, without albedo, this is going to be the most sort of over the top one. But I'm just going to do this real quick. I'm going to add a noise texture. And then okay, so I'm going to add a little noise texture. And then I'm going to add another pass with a facial material with a gradient. And what I want to do is turn the alpha on. Oh, I didn't get the order for this right. Okay. Uh, wait, I need to put this. Okay, I wanted to. Okay, I wanted to put these two together, but I kind of forget where I put the second pass. So I'm just going to put the gradient here instead. But if I put alpha on the gradient on one side, we can make it sort of transparent. And I wanted to add this together with the noise, but I forget what the order I have to do it in is. But I'll remember how to do that. Maybe I'll show it later. Because you can add a next pass, but I forgot order it goes. Anyway, this is getting more complex. It's probably not as useful. So I'll stop here. Oh, maybe I'm getting in. But we can add transparency. There's a cool way to add like a noise on top of a gradient, but I forgot the order to put it in, and I'll have to rework that out. But anyway, I think that is pretty much everything I wanted to cover. But it took a little bit longer than planned. Do you guys have any questions or any parameters that you want to go over? No, all right. Let me stop recording.